years after World War I, American foreign policy focuses on maintaining the country's position as a world power, on its terms. The United States will not allow itself to become entangled in alliances that will limit the country's freedom of action. In other words, it will operate forcefully, but alone.
In the 1920s, the United States became more insular. It's not to say that we didn't have international businessmen involved overseas, but the country was roaring along, and that reflected a view among Congress that we should take care of the United States and its own prosperity.
I call the 1920s the triumph of conservative internationalism. What I mean by that is that these conservatives in the Republican administrations of Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover did not follow Wilson's idea of a League of Nations or collective security. They thought, first of all, the public didn't want it, and secondly, that it wasn't necessary. Yet they were internationalists. They thought the United States should participate in world affairs.
The idea of international cooperation and democratization, self-determination, does not altogether disappear. There are the summit conferences throughout the 1920s, and the United States is very much supportive of those efforts.
The Harding administration was instrumental in calling for a conference at Washington in 1921-1922 of the naval powers. The aim of that conference was to reduce the navies of all the powers, that is, the United States, Great Britain, France, Italy, and Germany.
This conference is the start of efforts to safeguard the peace, as well as the country's economic interests. It culminates half a decade later in the Kellogg-Briand Pact.
The Kellogg-Briand Treaty outlawed war as an instrument of national policy. After the Second World War broke out, people mocked that as the utmost kind of idealism. But this was part of the mindset of the 1920s.
In the years following World War I, European nations are suffering from the devastation of the lengthy battle and staggering under a heavy burden of debt.
We refinanced our loans and reparations to Germany, and as long as Germany made war reparations to the Allies, they would repay the debts. But when the Great Depression hit in 1929 here and in Western Europe, the Allies just couldn't keep paying, and they stopped.
And the stock market crash in the United States touched off stock market crashes in other countries of the world. The inability of countries to repay their debts touched off a chain reaction which prevented or discouraged lenders from lending to other countries. The raising of a tariff in the United States in 1931, the Smoot-Hawley tariff, encouraged other nations to raise their tariffs. That diminished trade, so there was a downward spiral internationally.
And that proved to be also rather disastrous, because if the Europeans couldn't trade with us, they couldn't earn the dollars to basically pay back all of the loans which they had contracted for during the First World War.
The Depression also causes a crisis of confidence among people who usually support democracy as a form of government.
Because as people looked around the world in the 1930s, they saw that there were a few countries that seemed to be isolated from the effects of the Depression. One of these was Nazi Germany. The Hitler program was one of massive public works, and unemployment, which had been higher in Germany than almost any place else, seemed to melt away in the 1930s. Another place that seemed economically to be doing better in the 1930s than the democracies was the Soviet Union, where everyone was promised some kind of a job. Now, this job might be, in effect, slavery, but for people who were seeing their own societies collapse, it appeared as if the democratic way of doing things, private ownership, was something of the past.
At risk is world order. The Depression is toppling a number of existing governments and replacing them with powerful, belligerent leaders who see expansion as a solution to their country's economic problems.
And this came to a head in 1931 when Japan attacked China in Manchuria. Japan conquered Manchuria and set up what was called the puppet state of Manchukuo.
Japan renounces that legal conception of the open door, and that's going to have consequences which, in the end, will contribute materially to our going to war with Japan in 1941.
But the president, Herbert Hoover, was very reluctant to either call for a boycott of Japan, because that would have economic consequences, it would end trade with Japan, and certainly he had no interest in the United States confronting Japan militarily. He thought the United States simply could not afford that.
After the relative calm of the 1920s, the diplomatic challenges facing the Hoover administration seem ominous and bewildering.
And one of the things Hoover advocated was a moratorium on the payment of international debts in 1931, trying to have a fresh start. What Hoover appeared to be saying was that there was nothing the United States could do at home to end the Depression, and it made Hoover appear all the more unconcerned and out of touch with what was going on with the suffering of people economically because of the Depression.
When Franklin Roosevelt takes office in 1933, he inherits not only the worst economic crisis in the nation's history, but crisis on the international scene as well.
Roosevelt said very little about foreign affairs in the campaign of 1932. And for the first couple of years of his presidency, 1933 to 1935, Roosevelt continued this nationalist policy, including showing very little interest in international efforts to address economic problems. He thought the United States needed to go it alone and concentrate on what was happening here at home. These were very difficult times. Roosevelt was inaugurated president on March the 4th, 1933. Just 6 weeks earlier, on January the 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany.
Every country became so preoccupied with its own economic problems that there was not too much interest in or enthusiasm for international action. Hoover and Stimson, I think, had been much more interested than Roosevelt. The famous example is the so-called torpedoing of the London Economic Conference.
Mr. Hoover, I think, genuinely believed that there needed to be some kind of standard whereby all of the currencies would be tied to something like gold. Unless you had some kind of international agreement about exchange rates, it was going to lead each country to devalue their currency in order to increase their exports. Now, Roosevelt appeared initially to be somewhat supportive of that idea, and Roosevelt sent one of his more trusted advisors to London, Raymond Moley, to be the American negotiator. Well, during the conference, Roosevelt pulled the rug out from under Raymond Moley and basically said, we are not going to have any agreement about these exchange rates. We're going to manage our own monetary system alone.
And this was not limited to him, but to the United States. Other countries are doing their own things, building up their economic blocs. The British in 1932 established their imperial preference system, in which within the empire there would be free trade, but they would shut out goods coming in from outside the empire. The Japanese are doing the same thing in Asia. Germans wanted to set up an Eastern and Central European customs union, and so on. The world is becoming divided economically.
Roosevelt devalued the dollar, which to some extent outraged people who expected they would be paid back in gold dollars. Ironically, the devaluation helped, every business corporation that was in debt, because it reduced their debts by about 20%. But it was an example of how the New Deal was very nationalistic, in the sense of saying, we're going to row our own boat here, and we're not going to really care about the consequences of what we do to the world economy.
The administration, however, does have an interest in improving America's position in world trade, as evidenced by the Reciprocal Trade Act of 1934.
Which is the trade law that we're under to this day. It's just revised every 3 or 4 or 5 years. That law also reflected the latent isolationism in the country. Instead of us lowering barriers or liberalizing our trade laws to allow more trade to flow unilaterally, as the British had done in the 19th century, we would do that if other countries did it too. It was a reciprocal relationship.
As the nations of the world are distracted by their own economic problems, two major powers in Europe and Asia are making aggressive incursions into neighboring countries.
The German story is usually understood in the framework of the Treaty of Versailles, 1919, the sense that Germans felt betrayed by peace treaties, that they had to give up so much. The Japanese argument is that Japan itself didn't really have that much land to cultivate. There was not even enough rice to go around, not much minerals, iron, no oil at all. So the argument is that it was justifiable for the country to seek more space, to resettle the surplus population and to obtain iron and coal and oil that the nation needed.
The fact that many nations, including the United States, have become isolationist allows Japan and Germany to annex neighboring countries with minimal interference.
That was the time that Congress passed the first of several neutrality laws. These laws did what Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan had advocated 20 years before. It said that the United States had to stay out of harm's way, that the president should ban the sale of arms to combatants, that the president should ban lending money to combatants, that Americans shouldn't travel in war zones, because otherwise what had happened in World War I would happen again.
This first Neutrality Act was passed in 1935 after Hitler had come to power. The Italians were on the move. Mussolini was on the move. We're not going to get involved.
Roosevelt, who had been in the Wilson administration, remembered very vividly the problems that the war had created for Woodrow Wilson, and he was determined not to encounter those same problems for himself. Many people criticized him for not moving fast enough and decisively enough, and perhaps he didn't. But his reason was that he wanted to be sure that as we moved into the war, we did it as a nation that could be united behind the war effort.
So it takes the United States almost about the same amount of time to get into World War II as it took it to get into World War I, because people are so insistent that a European war has nothing to do with them, does not threaten their security, and they don't want to needlessly sacrifice American lives.
Alarmed by Germany's territorial advances in Europe, leaders of Britain and France arranged to meet with Hitler in Munich in September of 1938. They agreed to cede him the portion of Czechoslovakia he's already occupied in return for his promise not to expand further. But in the spring of 1939, he moves into the rest of Czechoslovakia and on September 1st launches a full-scale attack on Poland, both direct violations of the Munich Accords. 2 days later, Britain and France declare war on Germany. World War II has begun.
In 1914 August, war broke out in Europe, and Woodrow Wilson asked Americans to remain neutral in thought and action. When war broke out in Europe in 1939, President Roosevelt said, "We have neutrality acts and we will remain neutral."
This nation will remain a neutral nation, but I cannot ask that every American remain neutral in thought as well. I have said not once but many times that I have seen war and that I hate war.
Eventually, Roosevelt was able to persuade Congress to see that there was some sort of threat in Europe from fascism and militarism, and the Japanese in Asia, and that, for example, we would trade with belligerent nations, but they would have to pay cash. We wouldn't give them loans anymore because they still owed us from World War I, and they would have to carry away their trade on their own ships, so American ships wouldn't enter the war zone. And so Roosevelt continually fought and pushed Congress to do more for the democracy.
And in 1938, Congress increased naval spending by 20%, and Congress was generous with military spending for the Air Force, not the Army. When World War II broke out in Europe, our army was 16th or 17th largest in the world. Greece had a larger army than we did. Why? Well, armies get sent to Europe to fight in war. but the Navy and the Air Force will protect the shores.
But from about 1939, the United States does begin to show where it stands, that it begins to condemn Japanese action and begins to express its support for China and begins some small-scale assistance programs. The first one comes at the very end of 1938 when the United States gives China a loan of $25 million. It's a very small-scale loan. But from 1939, it's clear that the United States is not going to let Japan run all over China. That would be detrimental to American interests and also to the peace in Asia.
Once the British and the Free French were driven out of France, Nazis controlled all of Europe. The balance in public opinion began to shift towards greater American engagement in the war, although not yet towards actual intervention. And tremendous advances in war production, in shipbuilding, airplane building, building of other armaments, some of it to aid the British, some of it to prepare the United States for what many people were coming to assume would be its own inevitable involvement in the war.
For many months, the political talk of the country revolves around the question of Franklin Roosevelt's intentions. Will he break with tradition and run for an unprecedented third term?
And certainly within his own party, there were people who doubted it was wise for that tradition to be broken. The Republicans, of course, also focused upon whether it was in violation of the customs and the norms of the country. But ultimately, the Republicans chose a very interesting candidate in Wendell Willkie, who, to some extent, had been an opponent of the New Deal because he was the head of one of the largest public utility holding companies. But ultimately, Willkie proved to be a very charismatic and a very progressive Republican candidate. And in a way, that's very interesting because Roosevelt, one could argue, had as much an impact upon the opposition party as he did upon his own party. He, in a sense, pushed the Republican Party more toward the left.
Have attempted to picture me as an opponent of liberalism, but I was a liberal before many of those men heard the word.
The presidential campaign is dominated by the turmoil beyond the nation's borders.
By the summer of 1940, the German army has marched down the Champs-Élysées. There is the anxiety, the sense that very soon the Battle of Britain will begin. So there is the enormous debate about the extent to which the United States should be involved. There's also, of course, the growing concern about the Japanese aggression.
The election is closer than it was in 1932 and 1936, but Roosevelt, nevertheless, wins decisively. And in the last weeks of 1940, with the election behind him, he begins to make subtle but profound changes in America's role in the war.
One of the most important things Franklin Roosevelt did was to trade old American destroyers to the British in return for access to bases in our hemisphere. It was a kind of agreement that hurt the United States not at all and provided necessary support for the British in fighting Hitler and the Axis. Even more important was Roosevelt's commitment to what came to be known as Lend-Lease, basically where the United States agreed to fund whatever the British and other nations at war needed. Roosevelt and Churchill met together and drafted what was known as the Atlantic Charter that basically talked about no territorial aggrandizement and the, at least in general terms, shape of what the post-war world might be like.
And privately, Roosevelt told Churchill that he expected the United States would get involved on the side of the Allies in that war.
So the United States, in a whole range of ways, was becoming very actively involved. In time, American ships began to protect convoys going across the Atlantic, taking necessary supplies to the Allied powers, all of this without a declaration of war.
In the summer of 1941, Germany invades the Soviet Union, shattering the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact the countries had signed in 1939.
Some have argued that it was because they were hoping to gain control of oil fields that were controlled by the Soviet Union. Others might argue that it was a kind of irrational decision by Hitler motivated by his hatred of Bolshevism. Now, keep in mind, of course, that at the time of the invasion of Russia, Germany had already defeated all of Europe except for Britain, occupied northern Africa. So the great miscalculation was not so much taking on a second front, because at the beginning the Russian front was the only active front. The great miscalculation was not understanding how difficult it was to defeat Russia.
In the meantime, Japan takes advantage of the European crisis to extend its power in the Pacific. In September 1940, Japan signs the Tripartite Pact, a loose defensive alliance with Germany and Italy that extends the Axis into Asia.
So Japan and Germany and Italy become the axis of evil. The French and the Dutch and the British had the colonies, which the Japanese wanted. So Japan would be, in a sense, assisting the German war in Europe by invading the European colonies.
Given the Nazi emphasis on racial purity, how do their leaders justify this arrangement to the German people?
It was sold to the Germans as a temporary marriage of convenience to embarrass the Americans, embarrass the British, not anything that was profoundly philosophical that would bring the two countries together. And that's why there really is no trust between the two allies. I mean, there's no strategic coordination. Whereas Roosevelt and Churchill were meeting all the time. They were even willing to meet with Stalin during the war. Hitler and the Japanese leaders never meet during the war. There's not really any kind of strategic coordination.
Japanese aggressiveness continues against China, despite stern warnings from the United States. Finally, the president freezes Japanese assets in the United States and establishes a complete trade embargo, severely limiting Japan's ability to purchase essential supplies, including oil.
From the Japanese point of view, being a have-not nation, they could not do without further shipments of oil. The only place they could go for oil is Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies. So they make plans for invading the Dutch East Indies.
There is a consensus that the United States, through its intelligence apparatus, especially the fact it had broken a part of the Japanese military code, was very much aware that the Japanese were going to strike somewhere in 1941. The question was where.
Throughout 1941, there are attempts at negotiation between the two countries, none of them successful. A final discussion is scheduled for November of 1941 in Washington, D.C.
Bottom line was that Japan needed American oil. Without that, they could not survive. They said that their Navy had enough supply of oil for another 18 months. And if the United States could somehow resume shipments of oil to Japan, then Japan would desist from attacking Southeast Asia.
At 7:55 a.m. on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a wave of Japanese bombers taking off from aircraft carriers hundreds of miles away attacks the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor.
All of a sudden, the radio came on. Ladies and gentlemen, stay off the highway. Oahu is under enemy attack. The sign of the rising sun has been spotted on the wingtips. Radio silence.
We were expecting them to come by sea, and the air attack was a complete surprise.
That attack was brilliantly engineered, and it was devastating for Pearl Harbor at the time.
Smoke was pouring out of Pearl Harbor. Military police was in the middle of the road in front of Hickam Air Force Base.
The battleship Oklahoma had been torpedoed, and it had keeled over, and I could see little specks scattering on the hull of the ship. The men that were clinging to the ship.
And I started carrying buckets of water. All of the pipelines had been knocked out, and a doctor came out. He looked like he'd been in a butcher shop. And he said, "Will you mind doing us a favor? Can you get some of these bodies out of here?"
All of those fighter planes just destroyed right on the ground.
The commanders ordered the planes parked in the middle of the tarmac because they would be easier to protect against saboteurs coming in from the cane fields. But of course, when the Japanese planes came, it was just easy to get rid of them.
Japan has therefore undertaken a surprise offensive extending throughout the Pacific area. The facts of yesterday and today speak for themselves.
Pearl Harbor was a kind of godsend in a way to Roosevelt because it was such a shock to Americans that it united them behind the war and very quickly erased the debates and the dissent that had plagued him right up to December 6th, 1941. It was also, of course, a disaster because it weakened the Pacific Fleet. There's no evidence at all that Roosevelt knew about Pearl Harbor in advance and deliberately allowed it to happen. But once it did happen, it became the great event that allowed him to move us into the war with the united country behind him.
As Pearl Harbor and the events that follow will indicate, America's cautious and limited involvement in the international arena during the interwar years was not enough to protect the nation's interests, to maintain global stability, or to keep the nation from becoming involved in the greatest war in human history. Unfinished Nation is a 52-part American history series. For more information about this program and accompanying materials, call 1-800-576-2988 or visit us online at www.intelecom.org.